Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and I'm so thrilled today to be talking about the HBO movie The Survivor. We are joined today by director Barry Levinson, as well as actor and executive producer Ben Foster. And Barry, starting with you, I know that you were incredibly judicious in a lot of the research that you did, and in terms of the flashback scenes that we see throughout the film going into the camps, part of your research was also going to Auschwitz, talking to a lot of the guides and doing a lot of research. And I was interested from that element of research in pre-production, how that informed the creative choices you made and how you wanted to film those scenes and how you wanted to tell that part of Harry's story.
Well, certain research becomes valuable and you never know where it is or what it is. And I think at Auschwitz, it was very informative because we had a guide that had a lot of information, obviously, about the camps and how it functioned and what the people were talked about even. And so that was very informative, which kind of works its way into the film. You know, it's like, because we would say, you remember when because we were there, Ben was there, and we'd say, remember when the guide said, what about, this and that? And so there were things that we picked up that run throughout the film that was just gathered research one way or another.
Mm-hmm. And Ben, for you as well, kind of going through that scope of research and looking at a lot of the voices of survivors, I was interested in how that informed the way that you shaped this character, because you're portraying a real person who went through these experiences. And at the same time, it also feels very representative of other people's experiences as well. And so in looking at a multitude of voices of people who survived the camps, how did that help you in that space of really just meditating in and finding the emotional landscape of who Harry was as a character for you?
We worked with the Shoah Foundation, and they were able to also provide us with an enormous amount of detail and fill in a lot of blank spots for us. One of which we had Harry's testimony, and it's a remarkable interview. But I became greedy. I wanted to listen to more and more, and it's more of an intuitive process where I just wanted to hear more stories. I wanted to hear those voices in my head, and what I found was each story is unique. Each story is harrowing. But there was something that popped out in continuity was, how did you survive? Which is the question, is how did you, and many would say, I don't know, good luck. But more often than not, they spoke about the hope of being reunited with someone they loved and imagining them in those circumstances, that they might see somebody that they held dear, a brother, a father, a sister, a wife, a partner, a child, would help them. Just the thought would give them the courage and the energy to survive another day. And that stood out deeply to me as a way into this story.
Mm-hmm. And the shoot was incredibly short, and yet you've covered such a huge scope in terms of the story that you're telling. It was, I believe, a 34-day shoot in total, and that included kind of shutting down for a bit in the middle for Ben to do kind of like the weight loss at the beginning, and then the weight gaining back for the later scenes in the movie. What was kind of the moment where you both realized that even though it was going to be, a very fast and furious shoot to be able to tell this story, that it was such a necessity to be able to take that break in the middle of production for that physical transformation character-wise?
Well, I think Ben can probably answer that one, better. I mean, because it was necessary, because he lost 60 pounds for the camp sequences, and then you have to shut down. And how many weeks do you have to shut down in order to begin the next phase of the film? And so, and then for the third part of the film, again, we were shutting down for a much shorter period of time, because that one dealt with makeup and other things like that. So there was 3 stages to the film, because, even though the camp, in a sense, what happened there permeates his whole life. But in the actual shooting of it, it was it's probably 20, 25 minutes tops, but it has to be strong enough to haunt Harry Haft throughout the whole film. Because that being the point about, which we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, is that yes, he survived, but now he's got to be able to really live a life, for a great deal of the film, he's fighting the past. He can't let it go. And that would apply to, many people who tell the stories of post-traumatic stress disorder, which apply to, people in the military service and incidents that have happened. Even if you look to those in the Ukraine that have that have moved on, etc., what's that going to be like for them in the years to come? Can they just leave it all as a flash of a moment, or is it going to be haunting them? So it's something that, which drew me to the film initially, is the idea, yes, he was a camp survivor, but how do you get past trauma and begin to deal with life? Because it'll affect your relationships with all people, and certainly between your wife and your children.
And I mean, Ben, talking a little bit more about the physical transformation through the movie, it's about the emotional space as well. And it's a really remarkable feat performance-wise, because you're going through this physical transformation for your character. And then you're also kind of essentially still doing stunt work in all of the fighting sequences that we're seeing. And what was that space that you really found of having a character with a body that's really emaciated, that doesn't have the nutrition that it needs, but the emotional landscape as well of just that desperate need for survival day by day, because that's such a fascinating internal space character-wise to find, both physically and emotionally.
It's we all have a body, and whatever our spiritual belief is we're in one right now, and the door in for the way that I prefer to work is it's pretty simple. It's do the thing. That's about it. Just do the thing. Makes my job so much easier than having to, of course there's make-believe involved, but the closer we can get to an experience that's representative of what we're after helps. I made the decision, and Barry and I talked about it. We decided that we would go more analog and not digitize my body, which was at once suggested. And it was something that I wanted for myself, and something that I knew as an actor, rather than in effect being like, wow, he lost the weight. It's not an effect. It's when you see the pictures of people within the camps, you see the documentaries of people within the camps, you can't show up without in some way feeling so humbled, particularly listening to the voices of the survivors. It becomes our duty to best represent them. Knowing that I was working at deficit, I'm not in a concentration camp. I'm choosing not to eat. But that sensual experience of deficit informed the rest of Harry's trajectory. Some people like endurance sports. Some people like bungee jumping. I like acting.
And in terms of Harry as a fighter as well, looking, at the sequences when he's in the camp, but also later in life when he's gone through specific training in the sport, I was actually interested in how you both looked at the sport of boxing itself and how you wanted to approach that stylistically in the movie, because it's a sport that has evolved and changed stylistically over the years. So the boxing that we see now is not the same, maybe technique-wise, as some of the moves that we would have seen at that time. And so how did you look at the sport and really determine the stylistic approach of what those scenes needed to be?
We watched a lot. We watched a lot of the era's boxing. We worked with Clayton Barber, who did the fight choreography. He worked on Creed, and we became obsessed nerds of that era of fighting. In particular, the Jewish fighter Max Baer became a great influence for us stylistically. he was a brawler. It's not a lot of duck and weave. These guys are swinging their hammers, and getting to play with that style was without stunt doubles. You definitely you feel it, and what you see in the film. I mean, it's a contact sport, and hopefully that translates in the picture.
It does, and it's what's so striking about those scenes is that it's all about story and character. You know, there is an action to it, but it's very much about the way that we're experiencing Harry as a character, the emotional space that he's in at different points. And so off of that, Barry, I was really interested in how you determined a lot of the camera setups and the camera movement, where you're bringing us in so close to Ben's performance and making sure that we're always following his trajectory within the ring, within those moments.
You know, what we tried to do was for it to be somewhat messy, because the fighting is messier than the normal fighting, because Harry, as I believe it's the Charlie Goldman says, you know, you weren't taught right, you know, so that Harry as a fighter is not, you know, like the way you would picture in almost every fight film. He is a brawler because that's all he knows how to do. And so in a sense, sometimes you would look at a particular take and then you'd say, okay, so now we need to conform to that a little bit more than what we thought, so that what we're doing has a messiness about it as well. Rather than no, you got to be here so that the punch is coming, and so it's a messier style than you might do in a straightforward sort of boxing film, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And Ben, because all of those sequences where he's fighting in like his version of the present day element of the story, it's not just about the moment in the ring. It's about the emotional space before he goes in there, when he comes out, when we see him kind of singing to himself in the locker room. And I thought those scenes were such great insight into character, and was, you know, there's a lot of moments throughout the film where we really get to see Harry kind of alone for a moment and find that headspace. And did you find that having filmed all of the flashback sequences first really, really helped in terms of filming a lot of those scenes where you're solo, you're not playing off a scene partner, it's just about the introspection of character, because you know where his internal dialogue is as a character in those moments?
It's always a luxury for an actor, and I imagine as a director to shoot in some form of order helps you discover the piece together. And because we're adjusting and moving in time, decades apart, it definitely helped the coherence of that, and allowed Barry and his actors to be able to find spaces to improvise and listen to each other in new ways. Barry has a incredible intuition. It's an instinct for behavior, and as he often says, just don't say the thing. You can't say the thing. Whatever you just don't. We don't want to say the thing that the thing is about. And his approach to that frees us up as actors and encourages us to kind of. It's more like jazz rather than color by number work.
I mean, off the back of what you're saying with that, one of the scenes in particular that I know was like between you Ben, and Vicky, where, you know, he's kind of telling her about his biggest regret from his past. And then it, you know, the initial version of that scene had her coming over to him. And then Barry, you kind of changed that around a little bit. And you were like, well, what if you don't go over to him? And that really changed the dynamic of the ending of that scene. How did you kind of like determine what are the moments where we really want to kind of like change up the dynamic, play against the grain of the way that we have the scene ending at the moment like that?
Well, Barry, I wasn't there. I was somewhere else when you were watching, and you spoke to Vicky privately.
Yeah, because the scene originally had a conclusion to it, and it sort of stuck in my head that there's a conclusion to the scene, and sometimes. At least for me, I don't know why I keep sort of coming back to, and then the scene has a conclusion to it. And I didn't know exactly the answer, but I didn't want a conclusion. And we're just about ready to shoot the scene. And I said to Vicky, you know, at the end, when he finally reveals all this information, don't get up and go over and hug him. Don't provide comfort. And she says, well, what should I do? I said, just stay at the kitchen tables, just sit there. And she said, you know, and do what? I said, I don't know, just sit there. Let's see what happens. And I didn't say anything to Ben. And he finally, you know, reveals this information that he never wanted to give. And she just sat there and didn't say anything. And then not to give away anything. And then what happens after is just, I think, Ben, in a sense, into the scene well enough as the character just literally like explodes because he wants comfort. He doesn't get it. And then what takes place, I think, is more interesting than a conclusion to the scene with a coming over and a hug that we've now revealed something and he gets comfort for it. And so it's part of sometimes, you know, behavior is not predictable. And sometimes if you can find ways to really show the pain of things and the inability to come to conclusions by that which is talked about, then I think it's sort of it's more fascinating for the audience, I think, to get pulled into character behavior in the story.
Absolutely. And I mean, off of the back of the way Barry's describing that, Ben, you know, how does that change things for you as an actor working with a filmmaker like Barry and someone where it's not, this is the mark that you need to land in the scene, but let's kind of play around with it a little bit, find the essence of it. And so it's more of, you know, this is the idea of what we're going for, but also it's not a finite conclusion that it has to be played in that particular way.
Well, for better or worse, for other directors who I work with, Barry has shaped me. He gave me my first film when I was 17, and his style of approach, 20, how many years? 20, I'm not a math guy.
Me either. It's a lot of time.
Some time went by, and this, as I recall, memory is a funny thing. Style hasn't changed. The subject matter, the environments, but the style is exactly the same, which is we're pursuing something that feels credible, and generally, what's credible is idiosyncratic and uneven and generally uncomfortable. Because we're human beings, and lo and behold, we are curious creatures. And Barry's always looking for that. So kicking the tires of a scene is something that shaped me since I was 17, and have continued to approach work in a similar fashion because of that. I think some directors who've worked with me really appreciate that, and others haven't. And I just blame Barry Levinson. So.
I love hearing that, you know, and also like one of the other scenes, and this is diving into spoiler territory towards the end of the film a little bit, that I wanted to ask about as well, that it sounds like really had that essence of kind of what if we do things a little bit differently, is that moment towards the end of the film where you have Harry and his wife and they're sitting there after everything that's just gone on between them. And then he tells her a joke, and the joke, again, like not initially being part of the script. And so I was interested in what was the journey that led to that moment of like, well, what if we have this really sweet, connective, comedic moment that essentially is the dialogue of everything that they're not saying to each other right in this moment, because they don't need to have that conversation.
Barry?
I think that, you know, sometimes, you know, when there are certain spots you think, well, maybe we'll figure out something here when we get to it, because we'll be more informed by the time we get to it, especially if you're shooting sequences in continuity. And so for the ending, I thought they just sit there together as is written. In that particular case, I thought, well, what happens if this moment can take place? The sharing of this joke, and that, in a sense, it explains several things. But I've been carrying it throughout the movie, because early in the movie, he ultimately starts to tell that joke and to her when they're walking along the boardwalk, and then they get off of it. And then he comes back to it at the end of the film, but he comes back to it with a different resonance, because he's sharing something with her, in a sense, for them to really enjoy one another, to have a genuine laugh. And you realize, okay, he's that trauma is receding in a way, and he can suddenly have a moment of just the two of them just enjoying one another. And I think, without talking about it, but as opposed to using a joke to tell it, I thought it had an effect for the conclusion, as well as the conflict of this man and God, and that conflict, in a sense, is part of like a Jewish tradition, is that it goes back to, even if the writings of Shalom Aleichem, etc., where there's a conflict between the individual and God, and the questioning of God, and the arguing with God. And that particular joke, I think, sort of wraps that up. So Harry is in conflict in terms of, his relationship to God, in terms of what has happened. At the same time, he's able to enjoy the moment and then ultimately connect to his wife, and all of those things that you don't really like to talk about, because you just want to have it and you just enjoy the moment. But that sort of is behind it all, if that makes any sense. That it becomes just a human moment between two people, without talking about anything that really is, in a sense, connected to the script of wrapping up the piece, but I think has a good conclusion to it. So,
and the way he directed that was that we get to the beach, and Harry's going to go sit down with his wife, and they're going to hold hands and look out at the sea. And right before we start filming, he leans into me, he goes, the hat joke? And he had told it in full on set. It was referenced in 2 lines earlier in the film, but it was never supposed to resolve itself. One of the other beautiful signatures of Barry, which is, how can you wrap up a life? How can you resolve the scene? It doesn't happen generally in life. And that's Barry's pursuit. And it's a thrill to work with. And in this particular moment, we were going to hold hands, and that felt too much like a resolution, too simple. And he leaned into me right before rolling. He said, the hat joke. Why don't you tell the hat joke? And they set up 2 cameras. I was like, got it, sat down, and we did it in like 1 take. I tell the joke. It's on Miriam. It's on me. Never told it before. Didn't rehearse it. Wasn't written. It was told to me by Barry on set in front of the crew. We were all laughing months previous, and told it to Miriam, and something happened. We enjoyed each other's company.
yeah.
No, it makes for such a beautiful moment in that scene. And Barry, one of the other things I wanted to ask you about in terms of the stylistic approach and the way that you're using the camera to tell a story in the film is, obviously there's the difference in terms of the flashback scenes to Harry's time in the camps with the black and white, some of the elements that we were talking about before. But then there's still kind of like 2 other different time periods in his life that we're really touching upon. And so with those 2 later points, what were some of kind of the nuanced differences in the way that you wanted us to see the story and to follow Harry with the camera, in terms of like where you would have it set up, where you would have it following him for us?
Well, stylistically, there are 3, there are 3 parts to it, as you said. So, the first being the flashbacks, because all the camp stuff is flashbacks into his head. The late 40s has a different look from the 60s, so that if you were mainly so that the audience is aware of that this is not just continuous, that there are 3 different time frames going on. So with the cinematographer, it was like, well, then we need to have this palette for this section and this palette for that section, and try to find ways to elaborate that in the context of the piece. it also helped because of the locations, because then suddenly you got the real blue waters and the sand, and the whole color palette comes alive just by the fact of where you are compared to the earlier segments in the film. That in some ways is an easier, because that's a decision you make in advance. There are certain decisions you make about a film in advance, and then when it gets down to behavior, I always think that's going to continue to evolve, rather than no, he's got to be this or she has to be that. Yes and no, because there are things to be discovered, so that it seems spontaneous, and then for the audience, it's like, oh, gee, that's there's nothing better than if you can be surprised by a moment of a character doing something and you're just fascinated by it. So you're always looking for certain things that expose character without the person having to say something that is has such clarity to it that you go, oh, okay. I mean, you like what I'm saying right now is somewhat inarticulate, because I can't make it so perfect in what I'm trying to say. And I always find that on screen, when a character is doing certain things, that it's a slightly off center. And then in a sense, it engages us more. It's trying to pull us into what is he getting at? What does he mean? Rather than here's the pure clarity of it. Sometimes that takes away the joy of connecting and searching for a character.
Mm-hmm. I really love that. And then also similarly, Ben, with those two different later time periods, again, there's a difference in the physicality that you needed to find for the character, particularly looking at the later years in terms of everything that his body has been through in his life up to that point, from the camps, from being, a professional fighter for so many years. And so how did you find the two different physicalities of those two different later points following the camp scenes?
Well, you want to make it invisible rather than telegraph it, and the dance with older Harry, there's pride in surviving as well. There's self-loathing, but there's also an element of I'm still a fighter, and carrying those wounds but attempting to conceal them. And he can't, and it's like any trauma, and we've all experienced. If we're on the planet long enough, we're going to at some point experience moments in our life that go unresolved, and if we don't look at them, they will show up and make us look at them. So I'd say when it's finally getting to the point where Harry must face his deepest traumas by looking at his young son and trying to relate to him, but keeping him at distance to protect his child from himself in many ways. He has no choice but to confront his darkest moments. I'd say it's the most emotionally raw that Harry is, but the most pleasurable for me, because I got to eat pizza and drink wine, and a lot of it.
Well, I want to thank both of you for sharing so much about the making of this movie. Really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much, Barry and Ben.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.